Hey everybody, so let's jump into our ninth section of the course. We're going to talk about social structures, organizations, institutions, globalization, terms we've talked about before, but we're going to dig into them with a little more depth. And so in this section, in this slide, you can see the definition of social structures. You should know them by now, and you know that social structures, they create the framework in that all of us live. They shape our existence and our everyday interactions because they frame society. But I think it's interesting as you learn the difference between organizations, groups, statuses, and roles, and how they operate in these social structures. I want you to be able to see how these structures that exist are so massive and impose on our life, even if you have no interaction with them. You don't realize how they're restricting your life or dictating how you live. And the criminal justice system, being a criminologist, is one that I use. The U.S. criminal justice system is absolutely massive, especially when you look at our incarceration rates. You're looking at over 2 million people a year, but usually they estimate around 10 to 11 million people come in contact with jails and prisons at some point during a year, whether it be through multiple times or total. So it's millions upon millions of people. However, that severely undercounts all the people that come in contact with the system by just interactions with police, getting pulled over for speeding, getting stopped and searched, even though they haven't done anything. So that the system is massive, and you can see all the different organizations and groups and statuses and roles, all the kind of stuff that exists in the system. But think of the way how it's massive. The mere existence of the criminal justice system and the punishments that come with it probably dictate, how you drive, when you drive, around the speed limit. If you are a person of color in this country, it is dictating how you take your license out of your pocket before you drive. It's by dictating where you go to try to minimize interactions with the criminal justice system. It is having you think twice about doing something that maybe is in your self-interest, like a quick theft or something of that nature. It's even, if you see marijuana use as completely normalized and safe and healthy, just the mere presence of it being still illegal in many states, and the fact that it has a history of being policed and adjudicated so severely that it makes you think twice. You can't just, use marijuana without having probably some kind of concern in the back of your mind that the criminal justice system could show up and it could then impose itself on you. Because once you become a part of the system, it's nearly impossible to ever rid yourself of that experience, especially if you get the official label of an offender, of a criminal, whether it be through a felony or a misdemeanor. Now, so these kind of structures are massive. Think about our education structure, how massive it is and how much it's dictated your life and structured your life. And also all the norms that get institutionalized within these larger social institutions. Things like, we don't even think twice about the rules and restrictions in jails and prisons because we just kind of accept it as is. When in reality, if you're somebody that studies that and you go into these settings, you see that they're inhumane. And you see how harsh something like solitary confinement, something that is extremely dangerous, has long-term damages to mental health and physical well-being. However, we consider that part of jails and prisons, and it usually takes somebody to highlight the atrocities to most people for them to realize that it is an atrocity and push for change. It's just become a norm and practice that's become institutionalized. Now, the social dilemmas, this one, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I just think they're interesting. And that's why I have the activity for this week focusing on that, where you can think of a time either you contributed to the tragedy of the commons or the free rider problem, because, when you read the tragedy of commons, you're talking about livestock herding, and the free rider problem, you probably realize really quickly that these aren't antiquated concepts. These are things that, that still we can connect to examples in our life, especially, I use the example in the reading lecture notes of the free rider problem. Many of us now get our news for free online, whether it be through Twitter or through anywhere where we don't face a paywall. And that has a long-term consequence because local journalism is getting gutted, and journalism itself is being gutted because of people's unwillingness to be able to pay for a resource that we all benefit from and need in society, because the media and journalism is key for holding those in power accountable, keeping us informed. However, if we continue to be free riders and consume free media and free news without contributing to its existence, then we will see what's happening now, where it continues to get gutted out, and we have less and less reliable, good journalists that can spend the time investigating and getting us the information that we need. Now, bureaucracies is a big term in sociology, but it's something that you're going to see a lot. And bureaucracies themselves, they're meant to help to improve efficiency And so when you learn the term bureaucracy and you go through these terms, you're going to realize that you've come in contact with bureaucracies your whole life, and they've probably caused you a lot of pain. But you can also see how they can create efficiency, because in a bureaucracy, it's dehumanizing in that the idea is you are going to structure an organization and say, okay, there is a hierarchy where those at the top have power over all below them. But even below them, a middle manager, they don't have authority over those above them in the pyramid structure, but they have power over the employers below them. And so there's going to be a system of authority. That's a hierarchy. There's also going to be a division of labor. So everybody has assigned tasks that contribute to the overall functioning of the organization, but there's no duplication. So highly efficient. And also it's going to be impersonal, because you got the idea that every job has specific rules to it. So we can put in the idea is, we can put anybody in there with a certain level of competency and they can do that. And so bureaucracies, they allow organizations to operate efficiently. However, there can be iron cages in which they lock us into these dehumanizing jobs and these system of movements, and it strips us of our creativity. It strips us of our individuality as we just contribute to the efficient functioning of organization. If any of you have ever worked in an Amazon warehouse, you can see there's a lot more attention being paid to those, because Amazon is, of course, employing more and more people. But a lot of Amazon jobs are extremely dehumanizing. They put you into a specific role and give you written objectives, and you do that, but unless you are a contributor at the high levels, you're not expected to bring creativity to your job, to try to bring new ideas, to innovate. You're expected to do your job, and if you can't do your job or you leave, we can just replace you with somebody else. And that's dehumanizing, and why we're warned us about that dehumanization element of bureaucracies. Now, with that, organizations, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I think the reading and lecture notes are really exhaustively cover it, but I just want you to think in organizations how they're present everywhere, but often how they mirror individuals, in that they can grow, they can merge, they can evolve. But often organizations aren't as innovative as we think they are, because many times they just copy each other and imitate each other when they see something successful. And that's very common. Apple did it with the iPad. The streaming services, Netflix has become a behemoth in the media streaming services. And so Disney and NBC and other companies, rather than them coming up with some kind of new version of media, they're just coming up with their own streaming service to try and imitate Netflix. They've seen how successful it is. And that's where you can see how organizations are really dictating the operation of each other. But as organizations grow, especially as we get into these big multinational corporations, we're seeing when organizations are responding to each other and dictating the behavior of each other, and these kind of corporations are growing in power and consuming smaller companies and breaking across borders, we're seeing a more homogenous world where culture looks the same because we're all engaging this global consumerism culture. But it's also going to quell smaller businesses, more creative ideas, as these corporations tend to envelop smaller ones in order to keep them being successful. Now, when looking at these corporations and globalization, we need to think about, and I have a documentary I really want you to watch on here, and I've got it on Scholar as well, and it's a documentary on Nike, and it is a former collegiate athlete that essentially went to Nike sweatshops to exploit how dangerous the working conditions were, but how those in power at Nike weren't answering questions about it, weren't being held accountable to what they were doing. And as this is just a byproduct of modern globalization. And globalization is there's a lot to unpack for. We have a whole class dedicated to globalization. But in terms of just the basics, it provides us everyday advantages. For example, you probably get goods cheaper than you could before because and things like Amazon. Not only do you get goods cheaper, they get to you from all over the world within 2 days. You now have credit cards that have no national boundaries. So when you travel internationally, the credit cards you have, you can use there. You don't have to go get out, different types of currency. You don't have to do a lot of homework on the front end. They automatically deduct the transaction fees that happen. So all those are advantages. But there's a lot of disadvantages. And we'll just focus in on the cheaper goods piece. So you're getting goods cheaper, which is an advantage for the everyday consumer. But then the question becomes, well, how are goods getting cheaper? And what it is as these corporations essentially break down international boundaries, they are putting their production factories, their manufacturing facilities in countries that have less restrictive, less protective labor laws. and that have lower minimum wages. And so they're finding where can they open up their manufacturing plants where the labor is cheaper, so they pay less for labor to produce the goods that are then going to be sold, yes, cheaper to the consumer. However, the corporation's making bigger profit margins. And so there's disadvantages on multiple fronts there. One is because it's exploiting vulnerable people. It's exploiting people born in countries that do not have labor unions and laws to protect them, to keep them safe, to pay them a livable wage. So we're exploiting that. And you're also seeing now show up a lot of presidential politics about where have American jobs gone? We're going to bring American jobs back, that kind of rhetoric. And that kind of conversation has masked the larger complications of the fact that, the reason that a lot of these manufacturing jobs are gone is, one, automation. Automation is changing manufacturing, but also the jobs that aren't being automated, there's cheaper labor in other countries, and that's where the corporations are going. And so what's interesting about that, and kind of, the way then you would assume somebody that's lost their job to globalization, they have a couple options. They either, one, have to go on unemployment, or they have to retool their skill set for the new American economy. And that can be really hard, especially if you've been working in manufacturing your whole life. And it's led to a lot of gutting out. The industrial Midwest looks very different than it did, 30, 40 years ago. And that is as these corporations continue to take their factories overseas and exploit vulnerable workers in other countries. Now, what's interesting is the conversation we have around this is often, these politicians, because of trade agreements that lower the trade barriers, that's what's going on. And yeah, that's part of it. But also, we often don't have enough of a conversation around the corporations and holding them accountable for wanting to just find the cheapest labor possible, and for their only focus being on the profit margins and not on paying people a livable wage, taking care of workers, protecting workers, caring about their employees. That's a conversation that often doesn't happen. Why don't we hold those business leaders accountable for just exploiting vulnerable people in order to make a bigger profit, and then in the process of gutting out American jobs? So that's part of it. And globalization, like I said before, it's complex in a lot of different ways. But I think, and I'll wrap up this section here, a really egregious example of where that's happened recently with like how corporations have no national boundaries anymore is around cruise ships. So you all hopefully we're watching the news or reading the news. At the early parts of the COVID-19 outbreaks, we saw these cruise ships that were just essentially becoming petri dishes of COVID, and it was spreading like wildfire. People died on these cruise ships. And there's been some research around how much the cruise industry contributed to the international spread of COVID. And there's been really good journalism following up that found, these cruise ship corporate CEOs, they were getting briefed on how dangerous it was to sail at this time. They had good information from the World Health Organizations, from various different countries' health organizations that, hey, you're taking a risk by doing this because it's out there, it's likely to spread, and if it starts spreading on your ship, it's going to be hard to contain. It's likely going to result in deaths. They still sailed away because they wanted to make a profit. And so they kept sailing, and now they're trying to backtrack and claim they didn't know what they knew. And so that's egregious on one level, that they didn't have the moral decency to worry about their clients. They just wanted to sail in order to make a profit. But what's also been disturbing is now the cruise industry is saying, now we haven't been able to sail in months. We need a federal government bailout. We need the federal government to give us taxpayer money to help get this industry back going. Well, more good journalism has found a lot of these cruise ship companies, they aren't actually registered in the U.S. because they don't want to pay U.S. taxes. And so they register in another country. So they register overseas. They do not pay taxes into the U.S. government, but are now asking the U.S. government to bail them out. And so who's going to bail them out? The everyday taxpayer. And so that is where you see corporate greed, gross levels of corporate greed, not only taking advantage of people's health and safety, but also taking advantage of taxpayers. And that's gross, but also it just shows that as these corporations become more international, we have to stay attentive. So we can't just stay complacent and say, I'm getting goods cheaper, I can get my cruise ships cheaper, life is good. We have to see what's happening to people that are being exploited. We have to see what it's doing to the long-term economic system that we live in and the long-term damages that we're sowing for these everyday conveniences. And interrogate them, and also not just hold those in politics accountable, but also those private CEOs. Okay, Hope you all enjoyed that section, and I will return to the last section in a moment.